I would like to understand better what's the difference between self-love and egoism, because sometimes I get lost, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, egotism is self-love doesn't mean being self-indulgent. It means befriending ourselves. Now, the ego. Okay, I'm going to be controversial here. My Madhyamikas experts down the bottom here. Buddhism always gives the ego a very bad rap, right? And of course, liberation means freedom from the ego. But as long as the ego, our sense of self, right, is in pain, then we cannot very easily walk on a spiritual path. This is why yesterday talking about psychiatry and Buddhism, if the sense of self is damaged, meditation could even be counterproductive, right? So in order to walk the spiritual path, we first need a well-balanced, healthy sense of self. Shantideva himself, who was not any friend of the ego, points out in his Bodhicharyavatara that there is a big difference between pride and arrogance and self-confidence. And that self-confidence is essential on the spiritual path. You have to believe in yourself that you can walk. Now, until you get almost to the end, we have to take our ego with us. So, therefore, who is saying, I want to attain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings? Well, the ego, which is nonsense. But, it's nonetheless, that's where we're starting from, our starting point. So what we need is a happy, healthy, well-balanced sense of self to start off with, right, on the spiritual path. And so this is what wishing that we should be well and happy is like healing ourselves, forgiving ourselves, stop criticizing ourselves. Doesn't mean that we condone our faults. We can see our faults very clearly, but everybody has faults. If we were so perfect, we wouldn't need a spiritual path. We would already be there. So, we all have our problems, we all have our hang-ups, but nonetheless, like a friend, well, all our friends are not completely perfect, but we forgive them, we love them, because they're who they are. And so likewise, we have to give that sense of caring and love to ourselves first. That's not egotism per se, that's just healing. And so in the Buddhist tradition, apart from these meditations on loving kindness and compassion, there are also what is called the shamatha meditations, which are meditations for getting the mind quiet and calm and well balanced, because this is also very healing. After the sense, you can't go into deeper levels of shamatha practice unless all the psychic factors are very well balanced and healthy. And so when that is all in order, and the sense of, inwardly all the psychic factors are well balanced, then one can start doing the vipassana, the insight where you dissect the ego. But we can't do that if the ego is in pain. It won't work. You'll just end up worse. So first we have to heal. And so these meditations on sending friendliness to ourselves, befriending ourselves, making ourselves a good companion, is very important. It's a healing process. It's not to bloat out the ego and say, wow, me, I'm great. But to like a child, very tender, taking care.
This is really a personal comment from me. I did a 2-day workshop with you in Canberra, somewhere in the 90s, I can't even remember when. And at the end of that workshop, I took refuge with you. And so for me, and since then my life, some people might look at my life and say, what a mess. Because all kinds of things began to happen to me after that. But it's as you say, it's like they may look bad, but ultimately my whole life is profoundly different now. And I really want to thank you. And my life ultimately totally fell apart about 7 years ago. And not long after that, I did a pilgrimage to the 8 holy Buddhist sites, which was profoundly transformative on a very subtle kind of level. And so I'm just offering you my thanks because you were the beginning of my journey. And it's not been easy, but it's been wonderful. Thank you.
You know, the Buddha compared sometimes samsara not to a wheel, but to an ocean. I mean, the ocean of samsara is a very common example. And the thing with the ocean, first of all, most of us live on the surface of the ocean, on the waves. We don't go down deeper and deeper and deeper into the depths of the ocean. We're up on the surface. And in any ocean, there are waves, and waves go up and waves go down. And mostly we are completely immersed in those waves. This is our problem. And so sometimes we're up, everything goes well, then we go down, and then we go up, and then we go down. And so the Buddha compared the Dharma, to his teaching, to a boat. And he said that, as a boat, it still rocks up and down a bit, but it's not submerged anymore. And this is why the Dharma also is a refuge, because it helps us, if we really saturate our life with Dharmic principles, then it definitely helps us to ride over the ocean of samsara to the other shore of liberation. And this is why, especially when things are very hard and go very badly. When things are good, this is why the God realm is such a downer. Because you don't, who cares about boats, But when we are submerged in these very turbulent waves, then we long very much for a boat to help us to survive. And that's when, when people go through very, very difficult periods in their lives, that's when they're so grateful. I mean, again and again, they say, oh, thank goodness for the Dharma. What would I do without the Dharma? And I think anybody who has a genuine spiritual path, whatever it might be, would feel the same. I'm not saying it's just Buddhists who feel that. That if you have a genuine spiritual conviction, then at that time it is the one thing that people can hold on to, and it really helps them to survive and come out the other side purified. So, yeah. This is why, as I say, the human birth also is good. It's because it's not all pleasure. And most people find that actually from the painful parts, looking back, is very often where they learn. It's not that we want everybody to be miserable. And, we hope that we always pray that people may be well and happy, and free from suffering. But nonetheless, understanding that often our greatest teachers are things which, have caused us at the time to pass through the chasm of fire.
Yeah. Jetsunma. If I could ask, could you give some practical advice as to where we might get instruction, how we can support?
Where are we? Sorry, oh yes.
Yes.
What?
Could you give some practical advice where we might get some ideas of how we can support these incredible Sangha that we are so lucky to have? For a lot of us, perhaps supporting spiritual friends or guides amounted to putting money in the collection plate once a week maybe, and that was about it. But there's an absence of collection plates if you don't know anything or you don't go to a centre. How can we, or where can we get information about giving these women the support they need? Thank you.
Well, we have started a website, and I think also Aya Yeshe has a website. Our website is called the Alliance of Non-Himalayan Nuns. So you could look it up there, and it explains something of the situation and how you can help. And if you also speak with Aya Yeshe here, she is also working on the same kind of project and concern for helping with all these non-Himalayan nuns. Because it's not just Western nuns, it's also the reason why we have this big blur of non-Himalayan nuns is because it's not just Western nuns, but it's also Asian nuns who get ordained into the Tibetan tradition and find themselves in the same situation. Chinese nuns, Vietnamese nuns, Korean nuns who get ordained as Tibetan Sangha likewise find themselves, they're not supported by their own Sangha, and at the same time they're not supported by Tibetan Sangha, and they also have a hard time. And feel, again, very, as I say, it's not just financial, though that's very important, but it's especially, you're in limbo. You know, you're not accepted by the Tibetan society, and you're not part of your Western society. Where do you belong? And so, you know, this is one of the problems. It's a psychological problem also, that you don't have a sense, like, you know, in Asian countries, at least when the nuns, they're part of a society, they might have a very menial role, but at least they're part of the society knows who they are. Whereas these Western nuns, they don't belong anywhere. The Tibetans don't want them. And the lay people don't particularly know about them either. So you don't belong anywhere. And so you're, as I say, you're in this kind of limbo state where you're not really, you can't blend in the way that, you know, a native Sangha can blend in with their own Sangha and their own society. So this is also psychologically a big strain, you know, that they don't feel that they really, where is home? So yes, so we have a website, Non-Himalayan Nuns website, and also talk with Yeshila. And yes, we really appreciate any help that we can get on this. We are ourselves are raising funding so that we can, if you know, we cannot support nuns per se, especially not living in the West. We just don't have the resources. But what we are trying to do is at least raise funds so that if nuns want to go into a retreat, or if they want to do a study program, which they have to still pay for, even in Nepal and India, that we can help them with that. Or if they want to travel, like to Taiwan, to take higher ordination, we can help with that. Yes, dear.
At some centres they have Sangha support funds or support funds for the nuns if there's no monks there, and lay people can set them up and administer them, and that way they can help with the requisites: food, clothing, shelter, medicine. I'd like to add transport nowadays. Petrol's expensive. But yes, so if you are affiliated with a centre at all, anybody, you could go and approach the committee and just say, look, I'd really like to support Sangha. Chen Rezik Institute has a great model, and
It's not a great model.
No, but it has, at least it has something, sorry. It's better than the centre I'm at. It has a model where at least they can get some money each month or fortnight. So that might be something you could do at a local level as well.